Hey guys, welcome back to Remote Learning. Look, it does suck that we're all back here, but hopefully it'll be all over soon. Alright, so in this lesson we'll be learning about simultaneous equations with matrices, and by the end of this lesson we should be able to write equations in matrix form, be able to use the determinant to identify equations with no solution, and finally be able to solve using matrices. Alright, so we've done a bit of simultaneous equations before back in algebra, and simultaneous equations just means solving more than one equation at the same time. So often you'll just be given 2 equations, sometimes you might be given 3. Alright, our first goal for today, like we went through before, is to be able to write equations in matrix form. So we're going to have a go at writing this simultaneous equation as a matrix. So it can be written as 4, 2, 3, 2 like that. That's our first matrix. So all I did there was take each of these individual numbers and write them as a matrix. Next step is to write the letters. It will just be x, y there, equals 5, 2. So this is that simultaneous equation in a matrix form. Alright, so if that made sense to you, we've hit our first goal for today. We can write equations in matrix form. Alright, now I'm going to define each of these matrices as a letter. So I'm going to let A equal the first matrix. A equal this one there. Then I'm going to let X equal the variables, just there. And C equal this matrix there. Alright, so if I rewrite this equation with the variables or the letters, it's going to look like AX equals C. Alright, and if this was algebra, all I would have to do to solve for X is divide both sides by A, like that. That will give me X equals C over A. However, in matrices, it's not possible to divide by a matrix, so we got something else. So in matrices, like I said, it's not possible to divide by a matrix, but I still need to move A to the other side to get X by itself. I somehow need to get this over here, and I've got the answer below. The opposite here will be A inverse. So all I do is get rid of this A here and put an inverse of A there, so you'll have this in the end. X equals A to the power of -1, or A inverse times C. Alright, so to solve simultaneous equations with matrices, that's all you'll need to do there. X equals A inverse times C. If you put that in the calculator, that will give you an answer. And this is all assuming that there is an inverse for A. Remember, when we work out the determinant, if the determinant equals 0, there is no inverse, because the formula for an inverse is 1 over the determinant times the matrix here. Swapping the A and D and putting B and C as a negative. So if its determinant is 0, we can't have an inverse. Alright, before we solve this question or work anything out, I want to go through why this is how we solve simultaneous equations. Alright, so I'm going to go back to AX equals C. So my matrix A is on the left, matrix X is here, and that's C. So A times X equals C. Alright, now I'm going to multiply both sides by the inverse. So I'm going to have A to the power of -1 times A times X equals A to the power of -1 times C. So this equation here, this one here, is exactly the same as that one because I've multiplied both sides by the same thing. And going back to equivalent equations, remember, if I do one thing to one side and do exactly the same on the other, it's exactly the same as before. And now going back to the identity matrix. If I have a matrix and multiply it by its inverse, it always gives me the identity matrix I. So I'm going to have I times X equals A inverse times C. And what happens if I multiply a matrix by its identity matrix? It was just like multiplying a number by 1. So 1 times 4, that gives me 4. Identity matrix times a matrix just gives me what it is. So it'll just be X equals A inverse times C. So this is why we solve simultaneous equations with this formula. X equals the inverse of the matrix times C there. Alright, hopefully that will help you remember this formula. And now let's have a go at solving this without the CAS. Alright, so this has done the first step for you already. Our first step is to always write equations in matrix form, but this has already got it in matrix form, so we won't worry about that. Alright, so once we've written in matrix form, our next step is to find the determinant. And I'll just write the formula again. So if we had the matrix A, B, C, D, the determinant would just be A times D minus B times C. Alright, so for this matrix up here, that one there, the determinant, we call that matrix A, so we'll stick with that. would be 4 times 2 minus 3 times 2. So that gives me 8 minus 6, which is 2. So my determinant there is 2. I remember our next goal was to use the determinant to identify equations with no solution. So our determinant is 2 here, so that means it does have a solution. The only case in which it didn't have a solution was when the determinant was 0. I've got the formula for the inverse here, and the reason for that is we can't ever divide it by 0. So because our determinant is not 0 here, we know that there's going to be a solution, so we can go to the next step to find the inverse of the matrix A. So once again, I've got the formula for the inverse up here. Make sure you've got that somewhere in your books. It's just 1 divided by the determinant, and switch A and D, and write negative B and negative C there. So let's have a go at that. So A inverse is going to be 1 over that determinant. I'm just going to put that value in there, so 1 over 2. And for this matrix, I just swap the 4 and the 2, so it'll be 2, 4, and put a negative sign in front of the 2 and the 3 there. Alright, once we've done that, we can multiply, this is just scalar multiplication, so I'm just going to multiply everything inside the matrix by the number outside of it. So remember, multiplying by half is the same as dividing by 2. So that's going to be, that matrix there will be 2 divided by 2, which is 1, negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1, negative 3 divided by 2 is negative 1.5, let's get rid of that, and 4 divided by 2 is 2, and just put that into matrix there. Alright, once we found the inverse, remember to solve a simultaneous equation, formula was x equals A inverse times C. This matrix was A, that was x, and that was C. So let's just rewrite that. That's going to be x here, matrix x, and then A inverse, which we worked out down there, it's 1, negative 1, negative 1.5, 2, and then multiplied by C, that one there. Alright, just a recap of how to multiply matrices by hand. First step, I'll write that down, xy equals. First step was to multiply 1 by 5, so it'll be 1 times 5, and then we're going to add negative 1 times 2. So we always start on the top left and the top, and as you move across in the first matrix, we move down in the next one. Alright, next one, we move down, so we also need to move down here. It's negative 1.5 times 5. And then moving across here is 2, and moving down here, so plus 2 times 2. Alright, so if we work that out, that gives me 5 minus 2, and negative 1.5 times 5 gives me negative 7.5, 2 times 2 gives me 4, so that will give me, just running out of space, I'll continue my working out up here, that gives me 3 and negative 3.5. Alright, so just finishing that off, that will look like this matrix, matrix X equals that. So your final answer will be X equals 3 and Y equals negative 3.5. Alright, now that we know how to do that by hand, let's just make sure we know how to do that using a CAS calculator as well. So I'll just bring that up here. So first step, go into main and make sure you've cleared everything, because if you've got variables set, it's going to mess with your calculation. So make sure you've got all that cleared. Alright, next step, let's look at the equations again. So the matrix equation, that's what it is, AX equals C. We're going to jump straight to here with the CAS. Alright, so all I need to do for the CAS is type in A inverse times C. So let's do that here. Let's go into keyboard, that will open up this. Go into math 2, I'm going to start by typing in A inverse. So we've got this, all you need to do is put in matrix A, that's 4, like that. And then all we do here, we don't have to work out the determinant or anything, just press that here, that gives you the inverse. And then press times, and we'll go just multiply by C, which is that one there. So go to math 2 again, type in the matrix, press enter, and we've got the same answer as we did by hand. So we know we did it correctly by hand, and that's also how you solve it with the CAS calculator. If you do have any questions, please make sure you ask me in the Google Meets. Otherwise, that brings us to the end of this lesson. Hopefully by now we can all write equations in matrix form, can use a determinant to identify equations with no solution, and finally can solve using matrices. Alright, thank you guys all for watching. I'll see you guys all back online.